Hi class, today I'm going to go over the Puritan Bennett 840 ventilator for you. I'm going to give you an overview of the settings, the alarms, and some of the different features that this ventilator has. Before I go into any of the settings that you're going to choose, I just want to point out that the 840 has a feature that none of the other ventilators that are commonly used in the Valley have equipped. It's a fail-safe feature so that you don't accidentally plug the patient onto the ventilator circuit with incorrect settings or anything like that. So the feature is, if you go ahead and you have this circuit hooked up to either a test lung or to a patient, and you turn the on button on, it's immediately going to alarm at you and tell you ventilator is inoperable. And that's just a safety feature so that you don't accidentally turn it on and it just blasts the patient and causes a pneumo or something like that. So that's just one thing I wanted to cover before we go into settings. Aside from that, the power button is right here on the front, protected by a little shield door that drops down. All you do is just turn that on, making sure that there's nothing connected to your circuit. And then the ventilator powers on. It's going to beep and go through some different safety check settings, and then you can go ahead and go into programming. Alright, so the Puritan Bennett 840 has a screen that's set up very differently from the other ventilators. You'll notice there's a top screen and a bottom screen, and then there's this black line that separates it. Now, all RTs have their favorite vent that they tend to kind of gravitate towards, and it usually has something to do with which vent they learned on. This is my vent. I really enjoy the 840. I like the way it's configured. I'm a visual person, and so it makes sense to me the way they've organized all of the buttons. So you'll get into the lab, you're going to experiment with the servo, the Draeger, and the 840, and you'll kind of gravitate toward the ones that that you like the best. But I just want to kind of go over the screens and how they're set up. The top screen up here is going to display anything about your patient. So anything like tidal volume, peak airway pressure, mean airway pressure, if you want to look at your SCALARS, your loops, all of that's going to be displayed on the top. The bottom screen is all of the programming that you can do to the ventilator itself, in addition to the bank of buttons that you have down here. So I'm going to go through each different step and button to see what's inside of each of these menus. So when we first turn the ventilator on, this little window pops up and it says ventilator startup. It says same patient. It says new patient, and notice that I can just click on those buttons. They're all touch screen. The other one says short self-test, so you can do the SST on the ventilator if you wanted to run it through the testing. So now that I hit new patient, it's asking me for a wait. All of these buttons work the same way. You select it, it turns into this orange color, and now this button is used kind of like a mouse. You can either scroll up or down. So I'm going to go to 85 kilos, 187 pounds. I'm going to select it again, and it's going to save whatever I've programmed into that feature. Now I'm going to hit continue, and notice it does say adult ventilation. If you were ventilating a neonate, you would have to make sure you have the correct size circuit for that. We're going to go ahead and leave it adult for now. So I'm going to hit continue, and now some new options come up. The very first thing on the left over here says ventilator type, or ventilation type, and right now it says invasive. The other option is non-invasive ventilation, so you can use this machine as a BiPAP, CPAP machine if you needed to. We're going to go ahead and go with invasive because we're talking about mechanical ventilation. Under the mode settings, we have assist control, or AC, we have SIMV, we have spontaneous, and we have bi-level, or APRV. So we're going to go ahead and stick with AC for now. Same thing goes, you just scroll this mouse to pick which one you want to select. So we're going to go ahead with AC. The next type is mandatory type. Right now it defaults to volume control. You can go down to VC+, or you can go up to pressure control. We'll go ahead and stick with volume control for now. Go ahead and select that. And then over here there's an option for you to choose which type of trigger do you want. Do you want a flow trigger or a pressure trigger? And that's something that we'll get into more in Introduction to Mechanical Ventilation, with deciding which patients would you want to have a flow versus a pressure trigger for. So we'll go ahead and leave it with flow for now. I'm going to go ahead and continue. And now you're going to see that the small windows have gone away, and now there's a large window, and there's several different things to look at. The first up here is on the top left corner. It says assist control, so you know which mode of ventilation you're in. To the side of that says volume control, and it has a bracket that's showing you these are the settings that make up volume control. To the right over here, there's the flow trigger, and then you have the patient's weight. So we're going to head back over to the left side over here. Underneath assist control, the 840 displays a lowercase f for frequency, or respiratory rate. That's one of the things about these different ventilators you're going to find out is they all do the same exact thing, but they use different terms and different words for the same things. So it's kind of like having different types of cars and trying to get used to having to drive an Audi versus a BMW versus a Mercedes. Okay, now the frequency or respiratory rate, again, you just select it and you can go up to whatever you want. And one of the cool features about the 840 that I really like is that there's a graphic down here that displays the I to E ratio for your patient. So I'm going to go back to 10 breaths per minute, and I just want you to see the I to E ratio when you have 10 breaths per minute is 1 to 5. Your total cycle time would be 6 seconds, because that's going to be 10 breaths in 60 seconds, so divide that, you get 6, and then your I to E ratio, right now the inspiratory time is set to 1 second, and that gives you an expiratory time of 5 seconds. Now as we go up on the respiratory rate, you're going to notice that the I to E ratio starts to change. And it gives you an exact I to E ratio for whatever your respiratory rate is. So let's say a rate of 16, that's an I to E of 1 to 2.75 seconds. So that's a nice feature that the 840 has that I really like being able to see. So once I'm happy with that, I can either touch on the F or I can hit the button accept over here. If I hit accept, it's going to institute all of these settings. So it's important that we've worked all the way across the screen from left to right before you hit the accept button. The next setting inside the volume control bracket is the tidal volume itself. Right now it says 600, let's just make it an even 650. We have the flow here. Right now it's set to 37 liters per minute. And this, again, will also affect the I to E ratio. If your flow goes up, it means your inspiratory time goes down, and then you have a longer time to exhale. So I'm just going to show you, at 37 liters per minute, we have 1 to 2.54 second I to E ratio. I'm going to double that from 37 and let's go to 70. You can see that bar moving. Alright, now we have 70 for liters per minute for your inspiratory flow, and that's changed us down to a 1 to 5.7 I to E ratio. And so you can see that that graphic is affected by not only the rate, but also the flow. I'm going to kick that back down. We'll leave it at 40. Now, the 840 allows you to choose which type of waveform you would like, and you can decide to use either square. You can use the decelerating flow wave pattern, which we talk about being anatomically correct, and it toggles back and forth between the two. Now if you notice, that again changes the I to E ratio. Going from a square waveform to the decel is going to affect that graphic as well. Alright, moving our way over to the next section of the screen, we have the flow trigger, which, if you remember, we had a choice between flow or pressure. The flow trigger means that the ventilator is going to be sensing the amount of flow that the patient pulls out of the circuit. So the ventilator essentially is waiting for the flow to drop by 3 liters per minute, and then it'll say, okay, it's time to give a breath. Now, if I go ahead and change it, let's say I take it down to 2, dropping it from 3 to 2 makes the ventilator more sensitive, because now the patient only has to pull 2 liters per minute instead of 3. The opposite is true as well. If we go from 3 to 4, it's going to make it more difficult for the patient to trigger the breath. So there's different times where you would want to mess with the flow trigger and decide maybe we switch to a pressure trigger. That's stuff that we'll get more into detail with in Introduction to Mechanical Ventilation. The next setting over here is our FiO2. Notice right above it, it tells you your patient's kilos, 85 kilos, and you get to choose whatever the FiO2 is, and it scrolls just like all the other settings, and you unselect it and it saves. Underneath FiO2 we have our PEEP setting. 3 defaults on this ventilator. We're going to go to a nice round PEEP of 5 to begin with. And then the last down here is our high peak pressure alarm. So before we ever institute any mechanical ventilation, the vent is asking you to choose what peak pressure do you want to trigger the high pressure alarm. And that's probably the most important trigger that we have, or alarm on the ventilator that we have, because it notifies us that there's a problem with the patient's airway. Either a kink in the tube, they're biting the tube, there's an obstruction inside of the tube. So that's why it's asking you to pick your peak pressure setting. We'll go ahead and leave it at 40 for now. The rest of the buttons down here aren't specific vent settings, they're just different features. This one to the left here says screen, and it has a padlock. If you press that, notice the green light comes up, and now no one can touch the ventilator. So there's times where you have people in a room that are, they touch you, go around the room, and they mess with things, and so sometimes you'll have to lock the screen. We have a contrast setting, which changes the contrast of the screen, a brightness, which is brightness, volume for our alarms that go off. These two buttons in the gray window are important. The reset button means that if there's an alarm going off, you're going to hit reset, 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 and it's going to turn off the 2-minute silence button. So let's say the patient starts to cough, the ventilator alarms, and you hit silence. I don't want to hear that for 2 minutes. Let me problem solve or troubleshoot. As soon as you feel like, okay, I fixed the problem, I want to make sure I can hear my alarms again, you just hit reset, and then it turns off that 2-minute silence button. The info button takes you into some more screens so you can get information about the ventilator. We have an O2 calibration button, so we can choose to test the O2 coming into the vent, make sure that it is in fact 100%. The manual inspiration button means that you can give the patient a breath at any moment. You just push the button and it'll just give them a breath. Alright, the next two buttons are very important. We have an expiratory pause button and an inspiratory pause button. If you press the expiratory pause button, the next time the patient is exhaling, it will actually pause and hold that pressure inside the lungs. The same is true for inspiratory pause. If you press that button, the next time the patient gets to their peak inspiration, it's going to hold the volume in there, and it's going to draw out that long plateau pressure that you see on the pressure scalar. And that button is the method for which we're able to go ahead and have the vent calculate compliance resistance for each time that we're doing our vent checks. So both important buttons, you'll use them a lot in the ICU setting. Alright, so to move into the next set of options in this bottom screen here, we had the vent setup, which we did initially. We're done with that part. I'm going to go ahead and attach the test lung now so that we can begin mechanically ventilating it. And then I'm going to go over the alarms and the apnea settings with you. Okay, so my vent is on. I got settings programmed in. The lung is breathing. And you'll notice that the upper screen has graphics that are starting to display on it. Now the bottom screen, if we go back down here to the bottom, these settings that we programmed are being utilized. So this is getting a breath every 6 seconds, 10 per minute. The volume is set at 500. And what we're going to do is come down here to the bottom and we have apnea setup. Now the apnea setup is designed for when your patient is in a spontaneous mode. There's that 2-minute reset button. I'm going to press that. It's saying low O2 because we're not hooked up to an oxygen source at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that silenced. Now, for the apnea settings, it's when you're weaning your patient or they're in a spontaneous breathing trial and they happen to go apneic for a certain period of time. You want the ventilator to kick back into full support if that situation occurs, so that they remain being ventilated, their blood gas stays the same. So what we do is we want our apnea settings to mimic whatever settings we have on the ventilator. Now in an assist control mode, your patient's never going to go apneic, so it's kind of a moot point, but you need to know about these settings. So I'm just going to run through them real quick. We have our rate, 10, and that matches our programmed rate of 10. We have our tidal volume, 500, and that matches. We have flow, 30, that matches. Square waveform matches. The FiO2, we would just put that at 100%. And then down here, we have an option to change the apnea time. That's the amount of seconds it takes before the apnea settings kick in. So if the patient were to go apneic right now, in 20 seconds, the vent would kick back in and begin breathing for them again. 20 seconds is pretty standard, so we're going to leave that there. Notice that we still have this bar graph down here, and that's because you have a flow option here and you have a rate option, and that means that it's either of those can impact the ID ratio, which is why it's going to display on the same screen. So those all look good. We've got matching settings. The next thing we're going to do is come over here to alarm setup. And these are each of the major alarms that need to be managed while the patient's on the ventilator. In your class, you're going to go through the normals for each one of these and the rule of thumb for where to target. I'm going to just do a quick run through with you. This 30 right here, that is the current peak pressure. So it's telling us that right now, on each inspiration, we're generating a pressure of 30 centimeters of water pressure inside the patient's chest. This 40 is the actual alarm limit. Go ahead and reset that. So right now it's set at 40, which is a very normal ceiling for your high pressure alarm. It is adjusted the same way as all the other settings. I'm going to go ahead and scroll and get it down below the peak pressure of 30. So let's leave it at 22. And I'm going to unselect it and then hit accept. And then once I accept it, it's going to institute that new high pressure limit as 22, which will then immediately cause the vent to trigger an alarm. So we accepted it. Next breath's going to come. You can see high peak pressure. It says last breath was equal to or greater than the set limit. Check the patient, circuit, and ET tube. So that's one of the main alarms that we use on the ventilators to be able to determine what's going on with our patient, their airway. Is it patent? Is there any issue that we need to troubleshoot through or what? So I'm going to go ahead and change that back to 40, reset that high pressure alarm, and now it's gone. And then you can see again that the last breath peak pressure was 29. So we're going to leave that one at 40. Next one over here is respiratory rate, and on this 840, for whatever reason, it always defaults it to off, way up at the ceiling of 110 breaths per minute. We obviously want to know if the patient's breathing fast, and that's way too high. So we're going to scroll this back down. Right now we're set at 10. A lot of times we're going to do a peak pressure of around 30. If my patient starts to breathe a little bit extra, there's other fail-safes that will notify us that they're hyperventilating a little bit. This is more of a tachypnea alarm to let us know that the patient's rate is climbing and climbing. This next setting is our total minute ventilation. There's a high and a low setting for it. Again, if we're in assist control, this patient is guaranteed to get 10 500 ml breaths. So it's kind of a moot point in this case again. But for spontaneous modes, for weaning, we would want to know when their minute ventilation begins to drop. Sometimes that means that their anesthesia is still kind of lingering and still suppressing their respiratory centers. Could be a couple different reasons. Typically, we're going to set the low about 1 liter per minute below what the patient is doing, because we want to know if there's a significant drop in their minute ventilation. 5 liters is not a lot. Normal for a patient, but not a lot of room to drop down. So at around 4, we would want to know, hey, the minute ventilation is lower. The high minute ventilation alarm, we typically set up higher. We can give it some space. So we can go up to about 12 for this patient. It gives them a jump of about 12 liters per minute. This is the setting I was mentioning when I went over the respiratory rate total, that it's going to alert us to the fact that the patient is beginning to hyperventilate or hypoventilate. The rate alarm is more designed for tachypnea. Get that back to 30 there. The next settings, we have mandatory exhaled tidal volume and spontaneous tidal volume. We have both a high and a low. And so again, in AC, these two settings really are not going to do much for us. So the high volume is really the only one that could be activated. We want our patients to have room to yawn and breathe and things like that, so there's no reason that they shouldn't be able to take one big deep breath in. And again, in assist control, all they're going to get is that 500 ml breath. They will not get anything else. So we'll move that high tidal volume, spontaneous tidal volume, up and out of the way so they've got some extra room. Now that's an overview of your settings. Once you are complete with your alarms, you go ahead and hit your accept button, and it's going to activate all of the different alarms. And one of the things, if you've been paying attention, that you'll notice is that each time I touch a setting up here on the top of the screen, if I haven't accepted all the changes I've made in here, they go away. You'll notice that this high frequency alarm is back up to off, and that's because a few times I came over and hit 10 and 500 while I was talking. So if I go back, that setting has been changed, so we're going to take that back down to 30 again. This was set at 4 for the low minute ventilation, so we'll leave that there. We'll go up to 12 here, and those are fine. So now that they're all the way we want them, except now they're instituted and they're in play. So go back to apnea, back to alarm. You can see that 30 took, the 12, 4 for high and low minute ventilation, and then the spontaneous tidal volume alarm got moved up. So that's how you program this ventilator. So that's the indicator that kind of helps you figure out what type of breathing your patient is doing. It's a nice feature because you can see it from really far away, like across the ICU or across a patient room, and you can know exactly what's going on with your patient's breathing. Next number is our peak pressure. Right now it's showing 30. That's again what we monitor with that high pressure alarm, and that's going to fluctuate as the patient's compliance, resistance, things like that change. We have our mean airway pressure, which is 6 right now, and that will fluctuate again with the patient's breathing. Our PEEP reading, oh, look at that, it's dropped down to 3 again. We had it at 5 originally, so I'm going to accept there. This is just a reflection of the PEEP that the patient should be receiving. And there you see it's jumped back up into the 5 range. Our ID ratio is listed for us. Again, if we're down here changing anything with rate or flow, we get the graphic down here that's really nice that shows you the true ID ratio, but it lists it for you. We have our total rate right here. Exhaled tidal volume is listed here. And then we have our total exhaled minute ventilation at the top right corner. So again, like we were talking about the other day, when you have a patient that's, let's say, 69 kilos, put a decimal point between the two numbers, and that's the target minute ventilation you want for that patient. So that's the top of the screen. The next set down here is where our scalars and our loops are going to exist. You'll notice there's these arrows that are pointing vertically and horizontally, and those are designed for you to be able to resize your scalars if they're not fitting into the screen very well. This button up here, plot setup, this allows you to change what graphics are displayed on the screen. There's only room for 2, and so right now we have a flow time scalar at the top, and we have a pressure time scalar at the bottom. You can go ahead and go in and change plot number 1, which is the top. You have the option to go into pressure, volume, loop, pressure, time scalar, volume, or flow scalar. So I'm going to leave that as is right now. The next one is for the bottom portion, and for this one we can pick pressure, volume, or flow. It does not give us an option for a loop though. So I'm going to go back over here, click on our pressure, volume, and hit continue. And you can see the graphics have completely changed. Now we have a pressure volume loop rather than scalars that are listed. Go ahead and go back. We'll change that back to our flow for number 1. Yep. Pressure for number 2. That's back to normal. The other tabs down here, these are different features that help you be able to monitor what's been going on with your patient. This is alarms that have gone off, so it's showing that there was an O2 alarm, which we saw when we had the ventilator not sensing 21% oxygen. And then we have the peak pressure alarm that went off at 32, so it's going to keep a history or a log of some of those different alarms. This is a comprehensive list of every alarm that's been triggered on this ventilator, and you can see it's telling you the level of urgency of each one. We have a date and a time stamp, so we know exactly when the patient had these different alarms triggered, and then it tells us the description if there's an applicable description that goes along with it. Our volume setting there. This is our multi-screen setting. There's a lot of different options in here. I'm not going to go into at the moment. One of the things is the SST log. It just shows that every time the system self-test was performed. Those are getting into more advanced features of the ventilator. So that's an overview of the 840, how to program it, how to set up your patient, how to monitor the patient, where to look for all the different information that's available on it. All right, the next thing I wanted to show you is one of the features that comes up when we're doing spontaneous ventilation. Right now, there's a gap right here in our settings. You can see there's no options available there. But if we go back to vent setup and we go to spontaneous mode, one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to add in the option to add pressure support to the patient. Now, one thing that's very important to know is that on the 840, as well as some other vents that are out there, the pressure support setting is being displayed as above PEEP. So if I go ahead and I program in 5 of pressure support, I'm truly programming in a pressure of 10 with a PEEP baseline of 5. So it's very important that you're aware if your ventilator displays above PEEP pressure support or just a straight pressure support setting. Because if you're in a higher PEEP, like you have a patient that's on a PEEP of 12, you don't want to go over to a ventilator, add 12 on top of the existing 5 of PEEP, and then now have a baseline pressure of 17 for each breath. So something that's very important to consider. The other thing about spontaneous mode is once we accept it, I obviously don't have a real patient hooked up, I have a test lung, so you're going to notice that the patient is not breathing. There's nothing going on with the scalars. You can hear the sound has stopped. And after 20 seconds or so, a thing's going to pop up on the top that says, "Caution, apnea settings have been instituted." So in just a second, you'll see that pop up. The vent will alarm. And there we have apnea and low minute ventilation were both triggered. And it's telling us that apnea ventilation is in progress. And it's ventilating with the following settings. These were the apnea settings we programmed onto the ventilator. So this alarm is just going to keep going. The patient will continue to breathe on these settings, 10, 500, PEEP5, FiO2 of 100%, until someone comes over and acknowledges the fact that, okay, we had to institute apnea ventilation. I'm going to clear that alarm, and then you go back through and you would reprogram whatever settings, or maybe resedate your patient, whatever it is. But at this point, it just institutes, again, those same spontaneous settings. All right, one of the last things I wanted to show you about the 840 is that there's a screen up here that has different alarm tiers that can go off. Now, right now we've got green, which means everything's good to go. It's a nice indicator that things are good. There's not been any recent alarms, and you can see that from a really far distance. The next one up here inside the alarm box, there's this one exclamation point, and every once in a while something will alarm that's not critical. And the ventilator just wants to alert you that there's something that's non-urgent that you need to address. And so sometimes it'll light up yellow, an alarm will show up across the screen, and you'll hear the vent go, and it just does a single beep. The middle one has two exclamation points, and it's to tell you that there's something that's a little bit more important for you to pay attention to, or know that's going on. And so that one will go off, and it'll let you know, like you saw with apnea settings being instituted, it beeped twice for that one, and the yellow bar came across the top window. Now the top one is a red light, and there's 3 exclamation points, and that is a critical issue with your patient. It's going to let you know that something very bad is happening, and if you do not correct it, there would be a bad outcome for the patient. One example of that would be, let's say the patient is a little anxious, agitated, and they reach up and pull their vent circuit off of their ET tube and disconnect themselves. That obviously is a big problem. We want to know about that right away. And so this top tier alarm has a longer, louder alarm sound. It's going to go do 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 do, and it'll just keep doing that over and over and over until someone notices, hears the vent, and then addresses the issue. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the patient's test lung for you so you can see it go through that alarm, and then I'll clear it out and we'll talk a little bit more. So you can see the red alarm, circuit disconnect. I've gone ahead and paused it so it's not beeping at me, but that's the sound that you're going to hear anytime you have a top tier alarm go off. So I went ahead and plugged the patient lung back on. It's showing the red light still because it's letting us know, hey, something happened while you weren't paying attention or weren't in the room, and then you can go back through the alarm log to see exactly what it was. It says patient data reset. That doesn't match. I don't know why it doesn't show. It should say patient disconnect and let you know that there was a issue with the patient. Oh, here it is right here. It's listed third on the screen, circuit disconnect. So important lights to pay attention to, and those are the sounds that when you work in an ICU, you start hearing in your sleep because they just go off all day and you're running down the halls trying to find which room they're coming from.